Hello and welcome to the last session of today in the plenary room. Our panel discussion today will be talking about data. Specifically, we're going to be discussing the question, is data the most toxic asset you own? Did I hear someone yell no? No? Okay, excellent. Good. We've got a good start. My name's Tony Vizza, as you've heard. I lead the cybersecurity advisory team at Quartermentha. I'd like to welcome our panellists for today, Anna Gavros and Shimron Shimla, who are going to be sharing their experiences and insights on a subject that over the last 12 months has gained a lot of prominence and attention and is very much rooted in the idea that having too much data is no longer a good thing. Now, before I get the panellists to introduce themselves and wave their hand, let me set the scene for the size and scale of how significant this question today has become. So around the world, we have 5.2 billion active internet users today. So about 65% of the world's population is now connected digitally, which is a great achievement. Every second, 3 million emails are sent. However, out of those 3 million emails, 67% of them are spam, which is always interesting to know. The average household in Australia has 20.5 internet connected devices, and that was as of 2021, the last reliable data that we had. And if you don't believe me, I want you to count your computer, your smartphone, your tablet, your TV, your printer, probably your headphones, your router, your smartwatch, your cameras, your security cameras, any alarm systems, any streaming devices. Anyone got an internet-connected fridge? Not yet. Gaming consoles, I can keep going. By 2025, this number will be 34 devices. This is what we're looking at in terms of connected devices. Each one of those, from a cybersecurity perspective, has its own set of challenges and threats. The total amount of data in the world today is estimated to be somewhere in the vicinity of 120 zettabytes. So I'll tell you what 120 zettabytes is. That's 120 followed by 21 zeros. So get 21, right? And that's doubling every 2 years. Now, if you happen to be at my keynote yesterday around cybersecurity, you might recall me mentioning something about a data berg. Somewhere in the order of 20% of all data held by organisations is classified as business critical. Somewhere close to 30% of all data held by organisations is either redundant, obsolete or trivial or rot data. But what should scare everyone in the room is that the other 50% of data is referred to as dark data. And what's dark data? Well, that's information that a company holds that it actually has no idea what it is. Do you ever let your employees sync their devices to their corporate laptops or desktops? Yep, could be that. That's dark data. Do you let them download files to your computer? Yep, that's dark data. Do you have IT teams who run their own DevOps accounts, spin up another virtual cloud machine on AWS or Azure whenever they need to, using their credit cards? A lot of companies do. That's dark data as well. So we're going to talk a little bit more about dark data in today's panel session. For many years, it's been said that data is a new oil. I think that everyone here understands and appreciates the value of information. That's what you do as a profession, and I get that. However, in the same way that oil has gone out of fashion thanks to climate change, it almost seems as though data is following suit. In the case of data, there are schools of thought that suggest that data has gone even further along the toxicity route. So think of asbestos, which was once considered to be the wonder building material. And in fact, most buildings in the country probably had asbestos in them at some point in time. And in fact, we were talking just before the panel that up until probably 20 years ago, your brake pads of your cars, every single car driven in this country would have had asbestos in them as part of the brake pads of every car. Right up until, not long ago, it was a toxic, it was a wonder material, and now it's become very toxic. So, without further delay, let me introduce our panellists. Anna Gavros. Anna's the head of Northern Rose Fulbright's Information Governance, Privacy and Cybersecurity Practice for the Asia Pacific. Anna's practice focuses on privacy and data protection, cybersecurity and breach response, technology agreements, telecommunications and internet regulatory issues. Anna's one of the leading data protection lawyers in the Asia Pacific, has worked on some of the largest and most high-profile cybersecurity breaches across Asia, involving a variety of different threats and threat actors. She's experienced dealing with regulators across multiple jurisdictions in terms of both notification and investigation following a breach. Anna is also a member of the board of the International Association of Privacy Professionals, the IAPP, of which I count myself lucky to be also a member. Shimla is an expert in records and information management, leveraging machine learning and artificial intelligence. Shimron has over 25 years of experience in both vendor and in-house record teams. He's got a computer science background, thrives on using technology to drive industry advancements. He's responsible for aligning challenging business cases to innovative technology-led design patterns and approaches at Encompass, who are just outside, helping clients improve processes, reduce risk, and ensure data accuracy. In his experience in in-house records teams, Shimron spearheaded a number of different initiatives to modernise practices through technology such as artificial intelligence, natural machine processing, optimising efficiency and compliance. And I'd like to thank both of you for being here today. And we're very fortunate to have you on the panel. My legs get tired in my old age. Setting the scene. Anna, let's kick off with you, first of all. So the premise that data is a toxic asset is a big one. When I think about a toxic asset, I'm thinking about nuclear waste and radioactive green liquid, maybe three-eyed fish if you're a Simpsons fan. You're a lawyer, you've probably seen this play out from a legal and regulatory perspective. Do you think data is really that toxic?
I feel like I'm back in high school debating. Do I have to pick an affirmative or a negative team? Look, I don't think of data as a toxic asset in the terms that you talked about. I think of it more as kind of leftovers in the fridge. When you put them in, you know, they're crisp and tasty and useful, and that you can immediately see what the purpose of them is. And after a couple of days, you're not sure whether or not they're useful, or but you kind of maybe pick at them a little bit. And then after a couple of weeks, if you've forgotten about them, they've turned into a mouldy kind of thing in the back of the fridge that you kind of know you should get rid of, but you just keep ignoring. And that's what happens, I think, with a lot of companies with their data, is they're collecting it, they think it's a fantastic asset, they're using it, and then they're not thinking about what they do with it once it's aging. And, how should they store it? Should they purge it? What do they do? And so as a result, you end up with this mouldy bunch of data in the back of the fridge, effectively, which is a toxic asset, because, that's the stuff that we often see in data breaches as being taken, and everyone's like, why do you still have that data? And why do you still have the mouldy leftovers in the fridge? You didn't need to keep them. And if you'd got rid of them, we'd be in a much better position. So that's kind of how I think of the toxicity of data.
Brilliant. And can I ask just a little follow-up question? And I like the analogy of the mouldy food at the back of the fridge. I think a lot of organisations think of data maybe like a fine wine. The more we keep it, the better it will taste. No, it's not like that at all. So that's a really good analogy. I think from your perspective, and I wanted to ask just to continue based on your legal experience, do you see organisations sometimes look to comply with various different requirements to retain information and maybe not understanding those requirements well enough, where their thought is we need to keep it because otherwise we might get into trouble from a legal perspective? Do you see that?
Yeah, absolutely. There is a constant kind of tug of war between retention requirements and retention requirements to keep data, and then requirements to get rid of data, right? And we're often going through these data retention exercises where clients are like, but the law says we need to keep it, so we better keep it, and and then they just park it. But they're not actually thinking about what are the core requirements of the law, and really how long do we need to keep them for, and once that period has expired, then what do we do with it? So just because you're required to keep data, and there are many instances where you are required to keep data, and those are they vary across various jurisdictions, and you need to be aware of that. Similarly, you need to be aware of the fact that that applies to a specific set of data, and it doesn't give you kind of a blanket excuse to go, we need to keep stuff for a long time, so let's just keep everything to make sure we comply. You do need to understand the data and have a plan to map it, understand it, keep it where necessary, and get rid of it when you don't need it.
Brilliant. And Shimron, just related to this, and just referring to some of the comments that I kicked this discussion off at the very beginning, the fact that data was once considered, and even today might be considered the new oil. I think back 10 years ago, and the concept of big data and data science was taking the world by storm. What do you think's happened in that time?
I think Mae West said too much of a good thing can be wonderful, right? It does not apply when it comes to data. It has, I like Anna's analogy, right? It has a shelf life. And we look at it in the context of looking at a piece of information, it has business value. It has business value which we collect for a specific purpose, like a credit check, a credit history check. As we do that, it delivers that business value for a certain amount of time, and then we're hit with the other angle that Anna is saying, well, from a retention perspective, I need to know that I've done a credit history check on this individual for 7 years. Do I actually need the credit score? Can I be a little bit more discerning? Because at some point, when the data loses its business value, it becomes 100% liability. There is no benefit. You need to keep it, or you're obligated to keep it, or you have a reason to keep it, perhaps. But do you really need, for business purposes, to keep it? Why don't you take a more proactive approach and say, I need to keep the fact that I've collected it for the purpose of opening an account, for the purpose of, familiarizing or knowing my customer. I need to understand, as Anna is saying as well, when that data has lost its value, and then keep the record that I had it, not keep the data itself. Because if there is a breach, and statistically every organization is 100% likely to hit, is that right? I heard that statistic recently, it freaked me out. Then it will happen. Will I be able to look myself in the mirror and say, I really didn't need that? I could have got rid of it, and still, whatever was lost, as terrible as it is, I had to keep to run my business.
Maybe I can just pick up on the point that Shimron was saying as well about, looking at how long you need to keep it for, and can you justify it? And really, when you're looking at what data regulators in many jurisdictions are saying, they don't specify you can keep this kind of data for 10 years. There may be requirements for how long you need to keep it, but there's not like it's okay to keep for this period. Many times they say you can keep it for a period that you can reasonably justify it for. So you need to have a reason, basically, because at the end of the day, what's reasonably justifiable often comes out as when you've been hacked and a regulator comes to you and says, well, why did you keep it? And you say, well, I kept it because, I was doing marketing and that was an active customer and it'd been a customer for so many years. Okay, it's a reason. Why did you keep it? Because I didn't know if I was going to use it in the future and it looked useful is not a reason, right? And so you've really got to distill that whole process and actually kind of put a thought and a reasoning process into why you're keeping data if there's no obligation to keep it.
Exactly. Now, mindful that we do have a smaller audience, if anyone does have a question to ask, just raise your hand. I don't know if there's a roaming mic. Cam, are you okay with this, or have I broken something? No, excellent, brilliant. Because it's a good opportunity maybe to ask some questions that might really be pertinent on you. Try to go gentle on us though. It's towards the end of the day.
Hello, Peter from Defence. My question to the panel is, will AI make data more toxic or less toxic? Now, let me give you an example to give you context. A council in the US recently put mobile phones on people's cars. It drove around, measured the intensity of potholes, and council went, yippee, we know where to go and fix potholes and funnel our money quickly. Right, good on the IT department and the business. Then the information department got involved, and they said that data is bias. It's bias because you have to own a phone. You have to own a car. So therefore, you're not covering the citizens completely. So Anna, that opens all kinds of legal issues, I'm sure. For my AI colleague, once you start messing that toxic data with other data in the council going, we're going to give a 2% rate reduction to those people who collected the data, that opens another ball. And Tony, what business problems does that create? What business cases does that destroy? Because IT keeps working with the business and not involving the core DNA skills of this industry.
Thank you for the questions, Shimron, do you want to start off with the answers?
That's a really good question. I have quite a few aspects that I want to cover in here. I want to be succinct. So let's look at reality. Let's look at last decade's reality. We had information, and I think that challenge existed then and there. As a human being, I would have a look at information and decide what is the right thing to do with it. I would employ intelligence, artificial or otherwise, depending if it was me or someone else, right? But I would look at it and I would decide what is important. I might be curious just because I'm human, so I might be looking at things that I shouldn't be looking at, but I would be quite clear as this piece of information is important to make that decision. And I might want to keep a record that might made me make that decision, which means that what is important for me, and it relates to the previous questions as well, is for the purpose of reaching the right conclusion, I will take what I need. Same thing with AI. The thing that has changed is the 120 zettabytes, right? All of a sudden, that volume does not allow us to handle it. It does not absolve us of the responsibility. And I work with a lot of organizations that use AI, and the whole topic of responsive AI, very, very popular. Responsible AI is the decision is mine. If I decide to use technology for the purpose of allowing me to make a decision, who's accountable, right? That's a big ethical question, but ultimately it is me. So if I am able to leverage the technology in an ethical way to reach a quicker and more accurate decision, I am doing the right thing. What I do with the information afterwards is as important as that piece of paper that was on my desk that I read and I put aside. I know I'm not fully, I want to leave the legal question because I'm intrigued to hear what Anna has to say on that. But I hope that from an AI perspective, I'm trying to say that the same patterns that were ethical in the past, that we knew were right or wrong, we should still continue to employ and not go, that's an AI decision. You should blame AI for this, because we have to remain responsible in those use cases.
Yeah, well, from a legal perspective, I mean, you've got governments and regulators all around the world grappling with this exact issue at the moment. It's not that the fact that data becomes more toxic because of AI. That's what the baseline is, right? So when you're developing an AI product, you've got to take into consideration the nature of the data, the input, and then what kind of output you're training the AI, to use that data for. So what the various and there's, I don't think there's a regulator yet that knows completely what they're doing or has got it right. And you've got kind of various approaches. You've got, for example, in the EU, they're doing a very prescriptive AI Act, like a law that basically calls out different kinds of AI, not on their output, but on sort of what their sensitivity is as to what the AI does, and they're putting different sets of regulations around that. In some cases they prohibit that kind of AI. In some cases they become more highly regulated, where you have to kind of put them on a register where they can be kind of monitored in terms of their output, and then you've got kind of the lower risk AI, which is less regulated. Then you've got other regulators around the world. For example, Singapore is taking a very kind of industry consultative approach, where they're working with industry to kind of put in place frameworks where industry and governments, etc., can use these frameworks to create responsible, use AI in a responsible way, and understand the nature of the data and the outputs, and try and make it a more of a consultative approach. And then you've kind of got an approach in the middle, which jurisdictions like Hong Kong, for example, and probably the US are taking, where you've got different regulators, because every regulator is trying to get their hands on AI at the moment. Data, labour, competition, they all want a piece of the pie, and everyone's putting in different frameworks. I think data regulators have been the ones that have been most active, but in this case you've got the actual government regulators putting in place some rules that organisations need to follow when they're using AI. Now, no perfect solution yet, and everyone's kind of testing different things, but I think back to your kind of fundamental question, does it make kind of data more toxic? Again, I think Shimron's point was, that we're all still using these same sets of data, it's just using a massive amount more. So we have to assume there's bias in the data, so it's kind of up to us to train the AI on on cleaner, less biased data, which is part of the challenge, right?
Brilliant. From a business perspective, I think the short answer, and this is the shortest possible answer that I can think of, is garbage in, garbage out. So if AI is using garbage data to train itself, it's going to generate more toxic data, if that makes sense. But, I mean, without sounding too flippant, my view on AI generally is a little bit out of step with what mainstream people think around AI. Most people think AI is either going to change the world or destroy the world, in a good way, or destroy the world. I actually don't think either. I think and this is as a technologist going back to when I was a kid, right? I know when the internet was going to change the world and everything was going to be ruined or everything was going to be amazing, I remember hearing all of that, right? And I think AI will go through the same sort of thing. And I think we're hitting the peak hype in terms of AI. We're hitting that, right? We're now starting to understand that AI is not perfect. We've had lawyers overseas who have used AI to generate case notes and then look like complete idiots in front of judges because the AI has gone and created a whole bunch of fake cases and precedents to use, right? We know AI is not perfect, and we know AI will probably never be perfect, right? In terms of what's its value, I look at AI being a tool. The same way I go to Bunnings to buy a tool to do a certain thing, it does the thing, but I've got to know how to use it, because if I don't know how to use it, I'll probably lose a finger or an arm, right? But if I do know how to use it, I'll be able to make something really cool out of it. Right? And that's what we're also going to see with AI, is it's going to come down to creating a whole bunch of opportunities around how do you use this to enable what you need to do from a business perspective. I think a lot of businesses have seen AI as, oh, great, we can do this and we can sack 50% of our workforce. Dumb idea. It's going to help you do more with your current workforce and achieve higher levels of productivity, but that comes with a risk from a data and a toxicity perspective, because if it's not being governed properly from the outset, it's going to cause huge problems down the track. Does that help? Brilliant. All right, let's take a question around. Let's go back to toxicity once again. Oh, we got another question. Okay, this is good. We like
Thanks,
questions.
Cam. George from IMS. I was just wondering. I was just reading an article on the Privacy Act and the fact that they're about to change it so that the exemption that us little, silly small businesses enjoyed is now going to disappear, which I think is fair enough, really. So what advice have you got for us? It's the short question, because a lot of us don't have, I guess, the resources of some of the, larger corporates and so on to be able to obviously get ongoing advice. I mean, we do have some capability. Obviously, if you're in this area, you need to. But I guess more broadly, the question is, how are small businesses going to cope with this, and what do we need to do?
Anna, do you want to kick off?
Sure. Well, interestingly, the small business exemption is a real quirk in Australia. And no other major jurisdictions have that exemption in their laws. And so it's a very interesting one. And obviously, Australia is a country with a massive amount of small business, so that's kind of why that exemption has existed for the longest time. I think, honestly speaking, I think, everyone's got to start with basic data hygiene. And, it is going to be a lift and shift for many small businesses. So I'm not going to lie, there is going to have to be some investment and there is going to have to be some work. But, I think, in doing so, many organisations are going to have to look at that's a kind of an investment in almost an insurance, right? For any small business that's handling personal data, sensitive data, by making this investment in how they're managing the data may actually save them from having a huge liability later on from a data breach. So, it's kind of going to have to be baby steps for many organisations. The first thing will be to say, well, what do we have, right? Kind of map the data, work out what we have, where does it sit, why do we need it, and do we still need it, and can we get rid of some of it? And then also looking at what are we collecting? Because there's a real push, and we'll see that coming through in the new laws, and it's a theme with data protection laws all over the world, data minimisation. only take what you need. So it'll also make organisations maybe take a step back. Do I really need to collect that date of birth when I'm onboarding a client for a VIP program, to sell them lipsticks? Or can I just take their month of birth and then I know when I can send them the birthday promotion? It's going to be making decisions like that, along the way to work out, well, let's kind of understand what the asset is, let's clean out what we don't need, and let's then minimise what we've got so we can continue to keep in a good state. It is going to take investment, right? But hopefully it can be seen as a insurance against a future problem.
Shimron, did you want to add anything to that question?
I'll say that I've worked in small businesses and big businesses, and my preference is obvious. Those that know me or have seen my career, every time the business that I worked for has grown beyond a certain size, it was like, okay, time to go back to that quick and nimble. Similar, perhaps, to you, I always thought, if I had the resources, by the way, Louise, sorry, no offense, that was a great job that I worked at that agency, but there's always a challenge of looking at effectively competing. So if I had a way, or if I had thousands of people at my disposal that can help me achieve great outcomes, I would go, well, I have a fair advantage in a way. Along comes this piece of technology that works for me as efficiently as it does for big businesses. The way I use it means that now I have a competitive edge. But my responsibility is not different because I'm a small business. I still have to keep the same level of ethics going, well, Privacy Act, right? I want to do the right thing. I just don't always have the resources to do the right thing. Oh, technology comes to my aid. So the right use of technology, I think, will manifest as a great opportunity for small businesses, which is the blood of this country, right? I certainly see that, and I'd like to be proven right just because of my personal preferences working at small businesses.
Maybe I can just add on one other thing in terms of advantage as well, is that I think that small businesses will be able to use trust and kind of that as a competitive edge, to show that this is something that matters to them, because we know that we're in an environment now where many people in the last 12, 18 months have been the victims of data breaches, right? So trust and safety of your personal data is actually incredibly important, regardless of whether you're dealing with a small business or not. Actually, the individual doesn't care. So that's maybe something that, or should be something that can be turned into a competitive advantage, and promoting the fact that you are taking active steps to manage and protect data should be a way of further building customer trust.
I'm just going to add to a bit of support that's been put on so far. I'm just going to come a bit forward so you can actually see me, because I'm hiding behind the lectern. So from a privacy perspective, the privacy exemption for small businesses, and I'll give you an example of why I have a problem with that exemption, is because there was once a firm that I was assisting from a cybersecurity perspective, 5 employees, turned over less than the small business threshold. But what they were providing was the whistleblower platform for all the big 4 banks, the whistleblowing platform that, if you can imagine that ever getting breached and people being identified, would cause big problems, right? So to Anna's point around the exemption, while by and large most small businesses are probably not dealing in very sensitive information, I get that. It might be a small business with limited amount of sensitive information, but there are some that absolutely have critical information. So I think it's much more a test on purpose rather than size that I have personally been advocating for in the changes to the Privacy Act. It's, let's not worry about the size of the business, let's worry about what they do, and then if they meet a certain criteria, then we worry about them, and we have to be worrying about them. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah. And the reason why I was helping them was because they wanted to become ISO 27001 accredited. So they knew it was a serious issue. But if you looked at them purely from a small business perspective, they were a small business. They only did it because the bank said, you must get this, otherwise we're not buying from you, right? So, yeah.
You think of all the small medical clinics around Australia, you know, they have incredible amounts of data and sensitive data, right? You want them to be subject to that, to the Privacy Act, probably, and more. So, you know, they're great examples. It's, you know, it was almost a arbitrary, limit, the amount, because it's actually quite different when you're talking about the sensitivity of the data, the considerations.
Completely. So, are there any other questions? Otherwise, we'll keep going because we've got a fair few questions. I just wanted to give the opportunity to the audience. If we've got a nice amount of folks in the room where it doesn't get too rowdy, which it seems like we're quite polite, and I haven't mentioned there's drinks after this. Sorry, did I mention that? So, yeah, let's go. Shimon, I'm going to ask you to maybe chime in around data management, right? Now, I know that you're dealing with a fair few clients, many potential and actual clients will probably come to you to ask you questions around how to de-risk information, for example. Some of them might want to be looking at better insights around, you know, how to get more efficient use of data and the like. Some might want to get rid of data, right? You know, in terms of trends that you're seeing, what are you seeing out there in terms of understanding what organisations are doing around data, what they understand about data, its value, and do you think they have an understanding and appreciation that there's a life cycle view of data, or is it still a very static view of data?
We used to preach on the importance of understanding your data so that you can dissect it and look at it from different perspectives. And we used to preach because we were working in a field that analyzes data and understands it and explains it from various factors. Now the tables have turned slightly and people come to us and say, we need a better understanding of our data. So that change is a very positive one. It means that a lot of the research we've been doing is consistent with the outcomes that we're seeing. How does it translate to actual real life? I guess that's the answer on the life cycle. People understand that there is a life cycle element, and there is a point where you no longer need information. It's about what do I have today if I didn't capture that information before. So one thing that we do see, and Anna referred to it as data minimization, which I really like that term. We refer to it as lean data. Having a lot of information that is useless is more than just privacy risk. It's more than just intellectual property risk. It's also a drain on resources, on IT. So there's various pieces in the pie that would say that having less is more. Data, sanitizing data, duplicates. We hear these challenges all the time. What are we actually saying? We are saying that in order to conduct or in order to run a successful business or a successful operation, be it public sector, private sector, financial services, it doesn't matter, there is a certain set of information that if I could just have that, I would be more effective than if I had that and 10 times the amount everywhere. So that concept, we refer to it as a lean data concept. Organizations will work towards having the absolute minimum necessary to be successful and to be competitive, not just because of breaches. It is a much, I've worked on enterprise search projects when I was in my 20s, and we would have a competition on how many documents we were able to index. That is disastrous, because organizations do not need to index 50 million documents when they get 50 pages of bad results. It's inefficient, it's not productive, let alone the risk. I think that organizations are moving towards a stage where they go, we keep what we absolutely need, and we proactively remove what we don't need. What's the recipe to achieve this nirvana? Understanding what the information is from different angles, from different perspectives. So if I index my information, even the one that's 30, 40, 50 years old, and now I just found out that asbestos is toxic, I didn't know. Now I can go and say, and ask my data, do I have anything asbestos-like? And then look at my information from that fresh lens. If I can do that, then I'll certainly find myself with a much lean or minimal data pattern, I will be more efficient in my decisions. I'll be making more, because I have less waste. My IT systems will cost less. There's a win-win-win element. We all understand that. And the reason why we didn't do that until today is because of BAU. Our business as usual prevented us from going, I'll take an hour at the end of my day and clean my OneDrive. Who's done that? Not me. So if we can suddenly proactively and automatically achieve those outcomes, we will pursue them just because they're aligned to how we see the world, I think.
I'm just going to add, so before we came into the room today, Shimron and I were talking about, and this is the best analogy I've ever seen around how people treat data and information is who here knows that their garage has got too much junk in it? You know, who here's got a garage and we know it's got too much junk. We know there's stuff in that garage that we're never going to use again, all right? But yet we keep it because, you know, one day we might need it. And then one day, which might be 10, 20 years in the future, we realise actually we don't need it. Or it'll be our kids who inherit the house who are like, oh, why did mum and dad keep all this crap? Let me throw it out onto the street into the council cleaner. That's what typically happens. And if we do it as individuals, all right, this is where Marie Kondo's got it all right. Companies need to be doing something very, very similar. And to that point, they're afraid because they don't realise either we might need this one day or... But if you don't know what you don't have, to your point, if you don't index it, don't know. Anyway, just thought, just to add that in. Anna, I'm gonna bounce to you because you are a fellow sibling of the IAPP and on the board, as we noted, and I'm very familiar with the advocacy, the work that you've done, and promotion around privacy here and internationally. In jurisdictions such as in the EU, we've got the GDPR scheme. It mandates that information is only collected under concepts such as fairness, purpose limitation, data minimisation that you've already talked about, and storage minimisation. Just last week, the federal government here has indicated that it agrees either wholly or in principle with most of the 116 recommendations that came out of the Privacy Act review report that was published earlier this year. In your experience, are you seeing a trend towards or maybe away from companies that are looking at data differently as a result of privacy? For example, are they handling data more carefully given privacy obligations not just changing here but globally?
Yeah, well, I mean, yes is the answer, and as lawyers, we love new laws because it generally means new business because no one understands them except for us, and it always means that there's more stuff for people to do. So I apologise for that as well. But look, I think the GDPR was a great example, and I think we're probably going to see a mini version of that in Australia. Is people knew that there was going to be a real step change in how data was going, or data management, data security was going to be regulated in the EU, and they not only knew there was going to be a step change in what the laws said, but what the power that the regulators had in terms of investigation and also in terms of fining. And whilst no one likes to be regulated by a stick, unfortunately that seems to be the best way to get people to do stuff in any country. So I think and even last year in Australia, we had some amendments which introduced much larger fines around privacy breaches, and we could already see that the phone started ringing hot because people are like, there's a $50 million fine potentially now. Maybe I should do something. And so I think unfortunately the stick is what drives a lot of reform in the private sector particularly. So the threat of bigger fines comes with more compliance requirements, so it does generally drive more compliance behaviour. I think the other thing that really drives that kind of change in organisations is a big breach. And I think all of us in the data-related and cyber-related industries saw a real difference in attention from our clients and from what people we'd never spoken to before, with Optus, with Medibank, with Latitude. All of those made people go, oh, I don't want to be them, right? And so what do I need to do not to be them? And so a big breach, is always a way of getting people's attention. And we had conversations with boards and with CISOs as lawyers that we couldn't even get their attention to have before. So I think those are the things that I really see driving change in organisations, a big a couple of big public breaches and the threat of big fines really are usually the biggest drivers.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. Once you got the big stick out and people start to pay attention, and the public service announcement often doesn't work. Shimron, I'm going to ask you, maybe coming back to the board topic that Anna was just talking about. So if you're a board member and you're considering planning around how to look at data, all right, what would you suggest to them in terms of, from a data minimisation or going lean? What would be your advice to a board member to say, okay, you should be looking at this from your perspective for these reasons?
I think I would suggest that they reconsider their position. There is these times, there's a potential minefield because we're in a bit of a change period where we talk about, we spoke about AI and we spoke about privacy scanners and all these amazing things. But even if I was to take action today, there's always that too hard basket, the things that I don't know. So I'd probably say tumultuous times, but at the end of it, there is a light. The key thing is to consider here is there's an element of reputation, and the only thing I would add to what Anna said, which I wholeheartedly agreed, is that you mentioned 3 businesses that will probably be known for a very long time for the wrong reason. And reputation is key because recovering from a tainted or a broken reputation is extremely hard. And if that is the case, my advice would be assume that this will happen, or prepare for it to happen, or expect the worst, hope for the best, and go, from a reputation perspective, I'd like to be able to tell my shareholders that I've done all that I could to protect the data, to remove what I don't need, or what does not, or that poses a potential threat, and have the ability or the conscience to look at yourself and say, there's nothing more we could have done under the circumstances. Because any single one of those breaches, and also, sorry, I'll add one more thing actually from that Alex said recently. Don't just think about yourself. Think about your partners, your business. You'd store backups here. You would engage this legal firm and hold them to account as well, because it's not just you and what you hold, it's what your greater community that you interact with holds. It's more than just a privacy policy. If someone's data is leaked and it's because of a legal firm or because of a backup provider or because of any reason whatsoever, or a hosting services provider, it's still your name out there. That is, it's your data that was stolen. So try to think of it from internally, I'm going to do the best I can to maintain my reputation, to go, this happened to me, it happens to many before, at least I know I've done the best to minimize the impact. And second thing, hold my partners to account or force them to abide by the same standards that I hold myself accountable for in ensuring that they reciprocate and look after my information in the same way.
Brilliant. And I'm going to throw to the most obvious follow-on question to this from your perspective. Can you outsource this risk from a legal perspective?
No.
Thank you.
It's a hard no.
I had to ask.
It's a hard no. Look, and everything that Shimron was just saying, I completely agree with. I mean, you can't outsource the risk. You're only as strong as your weakest vendor, and you are accountable for the data that you are the controller of, the user of, that that your customers interface with you and think that you are holding their data. If you've given it to a vendor, then they will expect that vendor is treating it as you would, that you have done due diligence into that vendor, that you will have at least had some assurance that vendor will have adequate security, and so this is really key. And I mean, not only are you going to be accountable to your shareholders, but you're also going to be accountable to regulators as well. And we've seen in many investigations where there's been a leak that's been caused by a vendor, and the investigation is into the primary company, the data user themselves, not into the vendor, because they're often just a processor, which isn't often caught under many privacy laws around the world. So what's that regulator doing? they're saying, they're not just asking for the contract you had in place with the vendor. They're asking, what due diligence did you do on the vendor? What penetration testing did you do on the vendor? You had audit rights under this contract. Show me the reports for when you were auditing the vendor. They want to see an active engagement and understanding that you actually did have control over that vendor, because in terms of how they were handling your data. So, you know, it is really, really important that, you know, if you are using processes, and we all use processes in our business, that you not only select them as an adequate processor, but that you continue to ensure that they do a good job, because you are on the hook for that.
I'm going to follow up with, for those of you that might have been in the talk that I did yesterday, that third-party risk that's been talked about. And please don't take this as a plug for what we do, but I wanted to give you an indication in terms of how significant this has become over the last 12 months. The number one inquiry we now get is, we need you to do a third-party risk assessment on our upstream provider because we are concerned. And the number one finding from every one of these assessments that we do is that there is a lack of defined roles and responsibilities between the two organisations. And that's where a lot of things come unstuck for those organisations, if that makes sense. So you might outsource to a provider, fantastic, there's a contract in place, legal has looked at it, it's all well and good, everything's amazing. But on the ground, in terms of how that's operationalised, the roles and responsibilities are not communicated and partitioned effectively. Now, in the cloud world, that's been defined very carefully by the big cloud providers. They have what's called a shared service model, and they tell you, this is what we do from a security perspective, and this is what we don't want to know about, and this is your problem to deal with. But when it comes to using third parties, that's often not well defined, if that makes sense. And that's where we start seeing issues pop up. So from that perspective, I think a really good point to sort of add to the points that have been made. Anyone in the audience want to ask a question? I've got a few more that we're going to go through. We've got about 10 minutes. There's a hand waving over there. Thanks, Cam.
Well, Cam's walking over. I think I just wanted to add on to that point as well around the third-party risk, is that when you're putting in place a data management program for your organisation, you also want to make sure that that extends to the data that's being handled by the third parties. So you could have the best purge program in the world, but if your vendor is holding on to data longer than you have, then they still represent the same data risk. So, you know, it's important not only to make sure that they're secure, but they're treating data in the same way as you.
Completely.
Hi, I'm Chris Cole. I work at APRA, but I'm not asking the question as APRA, but more from a government perspective. It seems to me that the recent review of the Privacy Act hasn't necessarily solved, I mean, as government agencies required under the Archives Act and our retention authorities to keep certain sets of personal information for very long periods of time. And these disposal authorities, I guess, were written at a time when people had careers in the public service and went from joining to retiring and had one job in the public service. They seem out of date with today's reality, but we're still required to keep sometimes personnel records until people turn 80 or 100, which seems, you know, in this day and age, not necessarily the right thing to do. I totally get what you're saying in terms of be careful about and thoughtful about the information we collect now, but there is a whole bunch of legacy information that we have that we're required to keep for a long time. So I guess I was wondering if you had any advice on that front.
If that's okay, I might actually refer to a point raised earlier. You're right. It's 75 years from date of birth or 10 years from date of exit, the longer of the two. Is that right? And different jurisdictions have different legislations. Go to that point. To retain employee data, what is that data? What is that information? So the fact that you need to retain it in the scope notes, what do you want to retain? What do you need to retain, and for what purpose? Because you will find that there's a lot of information that is currently saved that in hindsight or in refreshed review of not even just the fines, right, which is an element, but of what you're actually keeping for the purpose of complying with this act or the other, is not as explicit as every single piece of document that you might have retained. Now, I didn't solve your problem, I made it worse, didn't I, right? Because now you have to go back to that repository and look at it all over again, and who has the time, right? So I won't lazily say use technology to your aid, but I will say that a risk-based approach is always a healthy one. If you know that back in the day before HRIS systems, you used to keep them as physical records and you have storage, and that's too hard to handle right now. But you also know that there was a first electronic system that was based on an Access database of some sort. You will know where to focus on to get rid of the information that's easily accessible and can be analyzed first, thus mitigating your risk by big steps. And potentially that garage is going to have that spade that broke, but it's just behind the compost bin that's a little bit cracked that I will fix next week, I promise. That's okay, but that spade might not. And it's quite cruel to think about information privacy, how it affects individuals, and go, oh, you weren't a high priority, but be practical in how you tackle this. If it's digital, I'd say there is absolutely every option to identify what it is, to what extent it's risky, and dispose of it in compliance with the Records Act, yet still keep the important employment information for those 75 years or 10 years from departure. I don't want to get too technical or too specific. It's an area that I'm very passionate about, but a risk-based approach would be my probably first recommendation.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I mean, it's kind of like when small businesses come in, once they don't have the exemption, it's a risk-based approach, prioritising things, taking those baby steps. I'm far less nervous about paper-based records than digital, and digital are easier to deal with, as Shimron was saying. So, yeah, I mean, there are absolutely these requirements. It kind of goes to the earlier question about applicable law and retention requirements against requirements to get rid of data. You do have requirements to keep things, but they're often quite narrow and quite specific. But our natural kind of the easy way of dealing with things, and it's human nature, is to go, oh, well, that's all going to have to go into that box because it relates to that, and I don't have time, or I'm not sure even whether it falls within the definition, so I'll keep more than I actually need to. So yeah, it is a hard answer, and it does require more work. But the only way really to sift through what you need to keep and what you can get rid of is to kind of do that analysis and really pinpoint what it is that needs to be kept. So yeah, it's more work than less, unfortunately. I think there's probably a lot of people that would just rather torch paper records at some point, but it's a great purging strategy, but it's not a good record-keeping strategy.
I'll just add, and I've been laughed at before when I've said to organisations, okay, if you're not sure whether you need to keep this information or not, and you're not 100%, put it on tape. Put it on a system that's completely disconnected off, all your active and online servers, and lock up that tape in a safe somewhere that's fireproof. And if you ever need it one day, it's there, and if you don't need it, no one's going to be able to access it. All right? And I've been laughed at, but at the same time, if you think about it from a toxic assets perspective, sometimes radioactive materials, you need them for medical purposes and whatever, but you've got to store them the right way. It's the same with information. So I think going back to the risk-based approach that you should be looking at, if it's risky, then treat it in a certain way would be what I would recommend and suggest. And again, to give you some examples in terms of, so I'm a 3-2-1 backup sort of person, so I have 3 copies of my data, all right? But I've got different categories of data from a personal perspective. My photos of my kids, I save on archive quality Blu-ray discs that I then give to someone for safekeeping in case everything else gets ransomed, and I've been told, oh, you're a bit, no, I want to protect those. So it's a case of what's risky, what's valuable to me, and saving it in such a way. And that's just an example to give you how to look at data differently and how to manage it potentially differently. Mindful that we've got 5 odd minutes left, I wanted to ask the panel a question that I had a few in the audience actually come to me after yesterday's presentation about ransomware. Not strictly a data as a toxic asset question, but kind of related. The question of ransomware, and this relates and goes back to the 2030 cybersecurity strategy by the government. They asked a question around, should ransomware payments be made illegal? And what are your thoughts around that? And I wanted to go to the panel and ask them, what are your thoughts around ransomware? Should ransomware be made, or should ransom payments to criminal gangs be made legal or illegal? What's your thoughts? Shimron, I'll start with you first, and then...
I'd like to hear Anna's answer, actually.
Okay,
I'm quite,
go on, Anna.
Yeah,
You go
got
first.
the legal angle there.
First of all, my views are not the views of my firm, so I'm going to put that out there. But I know many agree with me in my firm. I'm not in favour of making ransomware payments illegal. I'm not in favour of making ransomware payments. Don't get me wrong, but I think that it puts a victim of a crime in a very difficult position if you're going to make them a victim of a crime when they're trying to remedy a situation that they're in. Now, we don't, as a general rule, we don't advise our clients to pay ransomware. We don't want to pay criminals. But there are circumstances where, and particularly when you're dealing with small businesses, it may actually be the only viable option for them not to lose their kind of lifeblood. Paying a threat actor may be not only a much cheaper way, but the only way that they can get their data back, that they can get their business up and running. And to then turn around and say, well, if you do that, then you're actually committing a crime, is to me a really difficult position. So I'm really not in favour of doing that. I'm much more in favour of of what we were talking about earlier, making sure that we're putting the right emphasis on organisations to put security measures in place, to make sure that they are putting in place the appropriate technical and organisational measures to secure their data, to stop the ransomware attacks or prevent them. And we can never stop them, but to prevent them. And yet, throw some big fines at people. That's to me is a much better stick than saying, hey, if you want to pay, if you're already suffering a lot of pain, I'm going to give you a bit more just when you're trying to get out of it. So, my personal opinion.
Brilliant. Shimron, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think in reality, it's a very difficult position to be in, and it is an emotional position. So throwing legislation or restrictions at a situation that, if we put ourselves in those shoes, or if any one of you have been in those shoes, is a virtual impossibility. It is a very difficult position to be in. Generally, don't negotiate or don't pay ransom or don't acknowledge or anything. Organizations today leave aside a budget in anticipation for a breach, and that to me is problematic, because that budget, a fraction of it, would potentially solve that problem. Statistics will start showing up on the number of times that ransom was paid globally and what the results were. I don't think that those results will be looked at with positive lights. So for all those reasons, I agree. I don't think that it is something that I would throw into the mix.
Yeah, completely. And I asked the question because my answer is very similar to what we've just heard. If you can avoid it, absolutely you should avoid it. And this is both a personal position as well as an official position in terms of what we've stated to government in our submission to the 2030 strategy. We said we don't believe making ransomware payments illegal is going to solve anything. We do believe that if a ransomware payment needs to be made, that law enforcement should be involved and advised and consulted in that process. But ultimately, you don't want to be in a situation of pay in the first instance. What we've seen through our investigations and we've got a forensics and incident response capability, is that often cyber threat actors go looking for cyber insurance policies when they hack into a system. And if that cyber insurance policy says they're going to pay $5 million in case of a cyber breach, the ransom is usually $5 million. is what they're asking for, because the cyber insurer will probably pay it. All right. So you don't want to put yourself in a situation. That's why cyber insurers are now much more careful about who they're giving insurance policies and writing insurance policies for. And that's why, have any of you ever filled out a cyber insurance policy? Yep, they're long, lengthy forms, and it's quite hard to do. Just mindful that we and I happen to be the one thing keeping you back from drinks and the pool and some daggy dancing. Please don't look in my direction. We'll be seeing in a few hours' time. I want to thank our panellists for today, Anna Gavros, Shimron Shimler, who have discussed with us the concept of data and whether or not it really is a toxic asset. I want to thank the audience as well for your participation, questions, interest, and attending as well. So see you by the pool very soon. Thanks, everyone.